Good afternoon, everyone. Uh, Welcome to our May webinar. We took a little break last month because of the TLC conference, and now we're back and we'll continue to have our webinars every month. I activated the poll so you can choose your topic for June. The poll says April, and this is because for whatever reason, Zoom wouldn't let me rename it. So it is for next month, even though it is April. Once I'm finished with the main part of the webinar, before we go to the Q&A, I will close the polls so that we can see what our topic will be next month. Uh, this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are, we will be talking about guilt and hair pulling. Um, this is how we will go about doing this webinar and discussing this topic. So as always, we will first define what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about guilt. Then we will talk about guilt as a cause of hair pulling. We'll talk about guilt as a consequence, and then also about guilt as a maintenance factor. So something that helps perpetuate pulling. And after that, we will see what is it that we can learn from guilt and how to use the information that guilt carries so that we can change and heal. And then once we finish this part, as always, we will have our Q&A. I see that you already started asking questions. Just use the Q&A option, and as always, I will get to all of them in time. So let's start without, let's just start from the beginning. If this is your first webinar, then you might not know the man on the right. If it's not your first webinar, I'm absolutely certain you know who he is. So this is my favorite psychologist of all times, George Kelly. And I will use his psychology as my starting point, or rather his view of guilt. And then we will work with this definition, throughout the webinar. So before I explain this rather complicated definition, I want to tell you a little bit about how Kelly understood emotions in the first place, so that you have some context in which to place this definition. For Kelly, emotions were really just information. They're information about something that's changing inside of us. They're information about how we assess our behavior, or they're simple information about what's happening, inside, outside, or how we interact with the world. Essentially, one way to look at emotion from Kelly's constructivist perspective is to see them as a kind of internal weather forecast. So the same way that you turn on the weather forecast and tell you it will rain tomorrow, you can take an umbrella if you have to go out. And the same goes with emotions. Different emotions, the good ones or bad ones, carry certain information about the state of our psyche. And so guilt is no exception. And this definition here refers to the kind of information that guilt is providing us with. So Kelly says that guilt is the awareness of the dislodgement of the self from one's core role structure. I know this sounds very complicated, but it's really very simple. So awareness is just the fact that you are aware of it. You know what's happening, right? Self, for this purpose, uh, let's not get into the specific definition because Kelly's theory is a little specific. But when we say dislodgement of the self from one's core role structure, means that you are becoming aware of the fact that you are doing the exact opposite of what you think you should be doing. Or rather, the way you're starting to see yourself in the moment is the opposite of how you should be seeing yourself. So it is an assessment of how compatible our behavior is with our identity. So guilt says that at that particular moment, when we feel guilty, that our identity and our behaviors are kind of diverging. I hope this is the simplest that I can make this definition. So I hope it makes sense. Let me explain a little more specifically what I mean. So if you remember from my previous kind of talks that involved Kelly, he's a constructivist. So he basically believes that we use constructs, these kind of baskets in which we put our different experiences to make sense of the world and ourselves, obviously. So constructs come to us from our culture, from our families, from our loved ones, from our friends. They also come directly from our lived experience. Basically, a construct is a way in which you classify what happens to you. This is why I call them baskets usually. Um, you have many of them, as we all do, and they're not all equally important. So Kelly's idea was that they're kind of hierarchically arranged, kind of like this pyramid here on the right. So at the bottom of the pyramid, you have these kinds of small, less important baskets. So when you deviate from those constructs, that doesn't exactly cause guilt. You may be aware that your behavior is not, as good as it should be, or whatever you're saying or thinking or doing, it's not quite what you expect, but you still don't feel guilt. Guilt appears only when you start deviating from those constructs that are very near the top of the pyramid, because those are the ones that keep everything together, the most important ones. This is why I used the word identity previously. Or maybe a more correct word would be the self or our sense of self. So, how we see ourselves. When we deviate from that, this is when guilt arises. Uh, the way that Kelly talks about guilt or any other emotion is like this. He tells you about, let's say, he gives you a kind of formal definition, a description of the process, but he doesn't tell you what the content is. This is because constructs come, as I said, from our personal experiences and all kinds of factors. That means that we all have different constructs. We likely share some because we grew up perhaps in similar cultures or where we're given similar values by our parents and so on. But most of us really have very specific constructs. Even when we use the same word, it's still not necessarily the same construct. It doesn't mean the same thing. This, in effect, means that different people will feel guilt for different things. So, for example, what might make some of you feel extremely guilty might not do anything for me at all, because what may be a core construct, something on the top of the pyramid for you, could be middle or even the bottom of the pyramid for me. Sometimes it's very hard to compare, let's say, different kinds of guilt because the way that I see certain things is not only different, but it's not even possible to compare from how you see these things. Sometimes what I see is one thing, you might see as several things, and so on. So exactly what the meaning of guilt is highly individual, and the answer is always to be found in you. This is why when people come to therapy, I mean any form of therapy for anything, we therapists tend to ask a lot of questions. Sometimes we ask things that seem just blatantly obvious to people. I've had people roll their eyes at me when I ask something because it seems just so obvious. But from my perspective, when I hear 10 different definitions of the same word in one day, nothing is obvious anymore. So essentially, if you want to understand why you feel guilty or someone else, you really have to understand the nature of the construct that they're working with, that they're deviating from. Right? This also means that guilt associated with hair pulling can mean different things to different people. In effect, the feeling is the same, but its meaning can be very, very different. I will give you later on in the webinar, I will give you several examples of, um, I wouldn't say what everyone feels guilty about, but some examples that I see very often in my practice. They might help you kind of give you something to think about and work on and then come up with what that would be for you. Let's consider now guilt as a cause of hair pulling. So if you remember, we had a webinar, I think it was even last year, about experiential avoidance. I believe it was called emotional avoidance or something along those lines. And there we talked about hair pulling as a form of experiential avoidance. So hair pulling as a strategy that people employ so that they wouldn't have to process or deal with very intense emotional experiences. Very often that's anxiety, but it can also be guilt or really anything else. In some cases, it's not even the quality of the emotion that people like to avoid, it's the intensity of it. So sometimes even happiness can trigger hair pulling because a person has a hard time dealing with this kind of excitement in the body. So sometimes we can employ hair pulling as a way to avoid dealing with guilt, right? And to make things more complicated, guilt rarely comes alone. So guilt usually comes with anxiety and threat. And all of these are quite intense and quite unpleasant. I mean, guilt alone is one of the worst things that we can experience, as far as negative emotions go. And when you add anxiety and threat to that, you really have a deadly combination. It is extremely difficult to be with that emotion and not be overwhelmed by it. So then hair pulling comes in as a way to remove yourself from the guilt. I don't know if you, I guess some of you must have experienced those hair pulling trances when you become so absorbed in what you're doing that literally the whole world just disappears. So that's a good example of how hair pulling can help just simply remove you from whatever is happening. So avoiding guilt leads to hair pulling. And what happens with these kinds of avoidant patterns is that the more you avoid, the scarier it looks. I mean, that which you avoid. So the more you avoid guilt, the scarier the guilt looks. So, you avoid it even more, it looks even scarier, and basically you create a cycle there. And the reason why this happens is because guilt is kind of very razor sharp. It's very precise. If you think of the definition that I gave you, there's really no ambiguity there. You broke a very important rule, and guilt, if you follow it and listen to it, will tell you exactly which rule is that. So it will lead you directly to the construct. So it's not something that's vague and easy to misunderstand. However, when you start avoiding guilt, that means that you don't quite want to look at it. That would be the point of avoidance, wouldn't it? And then sometimes when you feel guilt, when you feel it coming, you basically just look very quickly, recognize it's something scary, and start avoiding immediately. And that means that you see it less clearly. And when you see it less clearly, it's much easier for you to project or read into it or think it's much worse than it is. It's kind of like in horror movies when monsters only appear in this kind of semi-dark spaces, and then when you actually shed light onto them as a viewer, you think, okay, that's a very cheap mask, right? But in certain lighting, when everything is fuzzy, they really seem very scary. And the same goes with emotions. When you avoid them, specifically when you avoid guilt, you make it very fuzzy, and that means that you make it bigger and scarier than it actually is. So by avoiding, you're actually feeding into avoidance. It's a very, very sinister mechanism. So let's consider now guilt as a consequence of hair pulling. So pulling, like most body focused repetitive behaviors, create this kind of paradoxical reaction. Initially, it brings this sense of calm. It soothes you. It's gratifying. It provides some sort of release. But then this release is followed by intense feelings of guilt and shame. Sometimes, and not even rarely, people will describe feeling both of these at the same time. So, gratification and guilt coexisting at the same time, which creates a very confusing and kind of bewildering experience. Now, uh, when you think of pulling as when you think of guilt, sorry, as a consequence of hair pulling, what you need to think about is, what does this mean to me? How does the act of pulling relate to my values, to who am I as a person, or rather, how I would like to see myself as a person? In in this case, guilt is a direct indication that you've done something that, so you kind of jumped out of who you're supposed to be. So I will give you a few examples now of how this usually works. So let's say that you pull, and not one hair, you pull several. Let's say it's a pulling trance. So it lasts, I don't know, half an hour maybe, perhaps even more. There's a point where you stop, and pulling tends to be kind of soothing and calming. So you are relatively relaxed, let's say, when you stop pulling. And then suddenly you see the damage you've caused, or you see the hairs on the floor. And then you think, Am I going to lose my hair permanently? Right? Am I damaging my hair somehow? So it's a health concern, let's say, or an aesthetic concern. What will I look like? And you have an image in your mind of what you would like to look like or what you're supposed to look like. If you're a perfectionist, what you should look like. And then you suddenly realize that what you just did is taking you away and not towards that image. And this is where guilt starts. So in this case, guilt would be a direct message to you about what kind of behavior is desirable. Sometimes people will perceive hair pulling or skin picking as well as a form of self-harm. Psychologically speaking, most of the time it really isn't. So I'm talking about how laypersons might perceive it. And they might think, okay, I'm supposed to like myself or love myself, take care of myself, and here I am harming myself. And guilt immediately comes about. Sometimes it's about control. People will expect to be able to stop. And then when they see that they're overwhelmed by the urge to pull, they feel guilty because for them, not having control perhaps means that you can't direct your life, that you can't become who you want to be. So in this case, it wouldn't have to do with damage or even the time spent picking or the hair that's lost, but with the mere fact that you were not able to stop when you wished to stop. Some people might perceive even this lack of control as a kind of weakness, and then they feel guilty because they feel weak. Again, it's not necessarily even about pulling itself, it's about what pulling implies. So, what constructs explain pulling? In this case, let's say it's weakness versus strength. And then strength is where you want to be, but you find yourself pulling, so you perceive yourself as weak. Because you're supposed to be strong, now you see yourself as weak. You're deviating from where you're supposed to be, therefore guilt, right? Sometimes people can perceive it as punishment. Sometimes it results from conflict, and in that case, when pulling results from conflict with other people, the place to look for guilt is in conflict. So, for example, if you perceive yourself as being a very, I don't know, very caring mother or father, for example, and then you get extremely frustrated with your child, as parents do, and then you start yelling. If you see yourself as a patient parent and then you find yourself screaming at your children to pick up their toys or something, that is guilt because you're deviating from something that is a core part of who you are as a person. If you feel like you have to be a people pleaser, for example, because otherwise people might not want to be around you, this is also a theme that I see not every day, but quite frequently. Uh, let's say you have a conflict, and then that means that you spoke your mind, you tried to set a boundary, you disagreed with someone. So you're not a people pleaser. Instead, you're risking being rejected or left, and then you're alone. And that's the opposite of where you want to be, therefore guilt, right? Failure, soothing, all these can be causes for guilt. Even soothing, for example. I remember I once had a client for whom the actual sensation of being relaxed was the cause of them feeling guilty because they're supposed to be productive and efficient. And only when you're productive and efficient enough, which by the way never happens, can you allow yourself to relax. And so hair pulling played this fantastic role where at the same time it would provide soothing, but it would be seen as a kind of self-harm, right? So you're both relaxing and harming yourself. So you have the relaxation and the punishment. So it was a very kind of complex knot that where guilt played a central role, which is that my client really needed to feel relaxed. It was almost essential, but it was forbidden because if you're relaxing, you're not productive. So just merely relaxing would cause them to feel guilt. And this way, when relaxation is combined with punishment, you get this kind of strange cocktail where you're able to relax because you're at the same time punishing yourself for something bad that you did. So even something is seemingly and superficially a positive thing, which is to feel, to soothe yourself, to feel release, can cause you to feel guilt. And this is exactly what I meant when I was saying that guilt is a very special feeling for every person individually. It's very difficult, or rather, I would say it's inaccurate to assume that because something feels good is good. It's the meaning that we assign to these things. So, for example, even things that most people, let's say in the US, would agree are good, like being productive or working very hard, when you go to other countries, it's not exactly a good thing. Not that it's necessarily a bad thing, but no one places any value on it. So, for example, if you transfer, I don't know, American work ethic to Italy, people are just going to look at you like you're weird. Why is this person working all day? What's wrong with them? Right. So, for example, what an American might feel guilty for, in Italy, no one would care about. And vice versa, obviously, for different things. So even soothing can be bad. So soothing can be deviating from where you're supposed to be. Now, let's put these together and then see how guilt, um, so we saw how it initiates pulling, we saw how guilt arises from pulling, and now let's see how guilt maintains pulling, and then let's kind of assemble the whole cycle. So let's take an example. I don't know, let me see what I mentioned here. Let's say control. I don't know. So let me just quickly come up with an example. So let's say you're a person that likes to have things under control. In fact, this is, a core mechanism for you. So this is how you keep your life on track. This is how you're, I don't know, a good partner, a good boss at work, whatever you like. So you have to have things under control. So you enter a period where your work is all over the place. There's just too much to do. There's not enough people to help you, but your sense of control doesn't really care because you have to have things under control. So what happens is that you start losing control. Some things sometimes, unfortunately, are really just beyond our ability to control. You start feeling guilty and you start feeling anxious and you start to worry. So you feel bad because you don't have things under control. In addition, you start to kind of ruminate on not having control, which makes you feel anxious. And then anxiety will give you anxiety will give you more rumination. More rumination will give you more anxiety. And you kind of put yourself in this horrible state of mind where pulling seems like the only way to go. So in order to avoid all these difficult emotions, the guilt and the anxiety, you resort to pulling. So you pull for a period of time, and then slowly you kind of feel the burden going away. Pulling can be really absorbing. You focus on that and it soothes you. You stop pulling, you look at the damage that you've caused, and then you think, what have I done? And then when you think, what have I done? That leads to more guilt. And then guilt leads to more pulling, pulling to soothing, and so on. Now, the trick, or I dare say the brilliance of this mechanism is in this, specifically in guilt, because there are two types of guilt here if you look at what I described carefully. So one type of guilt is the guilt that initiated the mechanism. So that was, I'm supposed to have control, but I don't. Therefore, what kind of a person am I? Right? So there's guilt number one here. So you complete the cycle, you realize that you've done a lot of damage to your hair, and then there's another level of guilt right there. So guilt kind of ups the game. You go one level up. So then the second guilt would be, let's say, I don't know, damaging your hair, then causing yourself not to look as well as you'd like to look. And then that sparks another cycle. And then the more guilt you have and the more anxiety you have, the more space they occupy in your mind. And I'm sure that most of you have this in your experience. When we're very anxious, we're really more likely to fail. And when we feel guilty, we're more likely to screw up even more, right? So this sets you up for even more failure and even more guilt. And then the cycle can spin like that infinitely. So if you think about it, guilt is basically the key link there. It's what renews the cycle every time. And then the way to stop the cycle, so there's no way There's no way to kind of end it on any of the stages. What you need to do is just jump out of it. And the way to jump out of guilt is to kind of change the way you think about what guilt means for you. So you have to outplay guilt in a sense. The most obvious strategies would be compassion and forgiveness, right? Because both of these give you space to make mistakes because you're human. And then, second of all, compassion is like a direct antidote to guilt, because compassion is aiming to reduce suffering. Therefore, it kind of alleviates guilt naturally. This is, of course, much easier said than done, because both forgiveness and compassion are kind of attitudes that we cultivate, something that we introduce into our lives. So it takes a while to develop them. But they would be direct antidotes to guilt. And then once you change the way you see guilt, you will then be able to direct this cycle in a different direction. The way that we commonly think of guilt is, I'm a horrible person. That would be my free translation of guilt. I screwed up, therefore I am X. And whatever that X is it's usually horrible. And what's wrong with that sentence is that no one is a horrible person. Sometimes we do horrible things, but that's not the same thing as being a horrible person. And Kelly's constructivism is acutely aware of this. For Kelly, guilt is never a judgment on who you essentially are. This is one of those wonderful things about constructivism, is that constructivism always emphasizes action and change. So constructivists, Kelly even says that at one point, that it's not so much what you are now, but what you set to make of yourself. That's what counts. So it's your next action that counts, not the one you performed in the past. And then also, because of the way that constructivism relates to knowledge, a constructivist can never say that we are essentially anything. We can only say that we see ourselves as something, or that there's evidence to suggest that we are behaving in a certain way. So what constructivism does is that it kind of removes this essentializing component of guilt. You're no longer a horrible person, you are a person who made a mistake. And now let's see what the implications of this are. So as I said in the beginning, for Kelly and most constructivists, emotions are kind of like a weather forecast for our psyche. So in fact, when Kelly wrote his giant 2-volume book called The Psychology of Personal Constructs, other than in the first few pages, like in the foreword, he never actually used the word emotion. And then that led some very careless readers to conclude that this theory doesn't concern itself with human emotions, which is really silly for a psychological theory, right? Kelly instead uses the term transitions, or transitional states, as I like to call them. This is precisely because for him, emotions are information that reflect the state of our psyche. And they're transitive because they talk about changes from state A to state B, right? From let's say happy to sad, or from just bored to entertained, whatever. So the emotion is in this transition. This is when it arises. So when we understand emotions as merely information, then we can use that information to do better or do differently in the future. I see that some of you are raising your hands. So the only way that I can translate that information is that there's something there that tickled you. So just ask the question in the Q&A and I will get to it, because I will be finishing in about 5 minutes. So what does it mean to learn from guilt, right? It means two things. First, it means that we are able to fully experience the guilt. And this may not sound like a very nice thing to do, but it is a necessary thing. Kind of like in science, if you want to understand a phenomenon, you actually have to look at it very carefully. So you can't be afraid, to look under a microscope and become a microbiologist. It just doesn't work. So if this is the group of phenomena that you want to deal with, then you have to be able to observe them very, very carefully. When it comes to our psychology, that means that we have to be able to experience something completely. And then the second part is to be able to decipher the information. So by experiencing it, you are actually looking at the information, and then you should be able to translate that information into words, and most importantly, into actionable words. When we start to put our emotions into words, they usually sound very vague and strange. But then as we do it more and more often, we develop a more specific vocabulary. And the more specific the vocabulary, the more useful the translation. This is why when people talk to me about how they feel, or when they write in TrickStop, they will often say things that, like, I feel uncomfortable, or that was unpleasant, or that was difficult for me. And so I understand that these are kind of very useful things to say to people you don't want to reveal too much of yourself from. But saying that you feel uncomfortable is about as vague as you can possibly be. It's not really very useful. It might be useful to, I don't know, hide your vulnerability from, people you don't like. But in terms of learning from an emotion, it is really not very useful. What does it mean to be uncomfortable? It can be anything from a bad chair to, I don't know, losing a loved one. It just means that you're not feeling at ease. So it's not very specific. Therefore, when we try to understand why we feel a certain way, it's important that we are as specific as possible. And for us to be able to do that, we have to see how our thoughts correlate with what's happening in our bodies. So, how thoughts and emotions come together, how they influence each other. If you want to understand that, then you obviously have to be very mindful and focused on what you're feeling. What I'm describing here is the exact opposite from the experiential avoidance that usually leads to pulling. Whereas with pulling, you run away from emotions. Here, you go towards them. In fact, as Frost once says, the only way around is through. And this is very, very true for human emotions. Um, I will read you a quote here from Pema Chodron. She's a meditation teacher, but she's a Buddhist. So there's like there's the word karma lurking in there somewhere. If that's not your cup of tea, just remove the word and take the rest. So she says something like this: people get into a heavy duty sin and guilt trip, feeling that if things are going wrong, that means that they did something bad and they're being punished. That's not the idea at all. The idea of karma is that you continually get the teachings that you need to open your heart. To the degree that you didn't understand in the past how to stop protecting your soft spot, how to stop armoring your heart, you're given this gift of teachings in the form of your life to give you everything you need to open further. So what she's talking about here is that instead of hiding from our, let's say, weaknesses, from our vulnerable places, we should actually open them up, because that's the way to understand them. You don't have to protect yourself from the world. Um, this is a place that I think from time to time in these webinars I come to, and I'm always very unhappy with the way I convey the message, because it's really an experiential thing, and words they're not very easy to they don't describe this very easily. Let me give you a practical example, like a very down-to-earth example. Last week, I was, not talking, corresponding with a client from TrickStop. And it's a client who's just starting the program. So we were exploring, what the urge to pull feels like and what happens to kind of generate the urge, like these basic things that you do in the first couple of weeks, trying to understand how the whole cycle operates. And then the client said that the urge is just unbearable, and uh, basically she defined it as a kind of electricity in her hands. And so and then she has to pull so that the electricity would just go away, so she wouldn't think about it. So I asked her to do a very simple assignment, to just put her hands in her lap when she feels the urge to pull, and just describe what she's feeling out loud. Like, so I'm feeling this and this in this finger, this sensation has this quality, and so on. So just like this. And then to try doing this for 2 minutes, and then to write back to me and tell me what she felt. And what she reported was that it was very unpleasant and it was very difficult to sit with. But less than 2 minutes later, most of these sensations cleared up on their own. So once she kind of opened up to what she was experiencing, she stopped running away from the sensations. So in meditation, in mindfulness terms, she stopped clinging to them. Because when we either want something to stay forever or push it away, that's both in a way clinging, because you're interfering with the natural flow of your experience. And so once she kind of just opened up to the experience itself, it cleared up. It doesn't always work that way, but the more she practiced this, the more she was able to experience the urge without acting on it. And this absolutely the same thing applies to guilt. So we were supposed to stay and observe the guilt. So now I'm having this thought, now this is happening in my body. And then what you do there is you do two things. One, you collect information so that you can learn from guilt later on. And then second of all, you're actually diffusing the guilt. By observing the sensations and kind of remaining calm, you're practicing equanimity, more or less. And that means that you can have these very intense experiences come and then go without being swayed by them, without being overwhelmed. People often tell me that this is not possible, that they can't do this. This is always false. Everyone can do this. It's very difficult, but everyone can do this. It's a skill. So it's a skill that we practice and we cultivate. It takes time to do it, but it is absolutely possible. So once we learn to open ourselves up, so just one more thing. I think this quote that I took, I forgot where I took it from, but Pema Chodron has this book called Let Everything Be Your Teacher. And I think this is a very beautiful constructivist thing to say. Instead of seeing guilt as you being a horrible person, you can see it as, reality telling you which way you need to go. So how do we learn from guilt? The way that I described guilt in the beginning would, I think, imply this first thing here, which is we did something wrong, so we can analyze our behavior and see how we can change it so that it better aligns with who we are. That would be a very obvious thing to do. And this is what most of the time we do. But there's also another direction that you can take, which is this value useful to me? It's a part of who I am, but is it really improving my life? Because in the way that we look at everything in constructivism is in terms of its function. So when you, like, the function of hair pulling is, for example, to soothe someone, or the function is to run away from intense emotions, right? So one thing can have several functions, obviously, but this is what we always ask ourselves, because meaning arises from function. So this is a very fundamental thing to do. In general, our identities are supposed to help us navigate life. They're supposed to keep our meaning together and tell us which way to go, tell us what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong, right? They're supposed to pave the way to some sort of well-being. If your values don't do that, if they cause suffering because of the way they're defined, because of the way that you cultivate them, because of what their content is, then they have to go. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try, and every perfectionist will understand this deeply, no matter how hard you try, you simply cannot align your behavior with how you see yourself, because how you see yourself isn't viable, isn't functional, isn't doable. In that case, as difficult as it is, it's the value, it's a part of our identity that has to go. And it doesn't have to go because it's intrinsically bad. It has to go because it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, it has no space in our mind. So these are the two directions in which you can go to learn more about guilt, or rather to learn from guilt, which is A, can I actually modify my behavior? And this is not, when I'm talking about this, I don't mean in principle, in theory. I mean in my life right now. Can I do better? This is a question that requires a degree of honesty, because very often guilt comes from us ignoring our limitations, ignoring our current life context, for example. Like if you're tired or exhausted or overworked, there is some level of productivity, or I don't know, certain activities that you might dearly want to do but can't, then you just can't do them. And you cannot align your behavior to your values, and that's just it. In that case, you have to change the way you go about cultivating the value or change the value itself. By this, I mean, let me come up with an example. So let's say it's, see, whenever you need an example, it runs away. And I like to surprise myself with my examples, and then, so I don't always prepare them in advance, and unless obviously I'm presenting a whole case. And then now when I need one, I can't think of one. But let's say that I'm a therapist, right? Let me just talk badly about myself for a while. So let's say I'm a therapist. Let's say hypothetically I'm defining my role as, among other things, having to be completely present with my clients and never distracted. And then let's say I'm a therapist who has, I don't know, like some insane amount of college debt or whatever to repay. So that means that I'm a therapist who has to be exceedingly present, always very focused, but I'm also a therapist who has to work a lot to pay off the debt that I have, right? And these two can cause a fair amount of problems, because there will come a point where I will no longer be able to focus well in my sessions, and then my mind might start wandering, and then I will feel guilty because that's the case. And then when I start feeling guilty, I might become obsessed with how bad I am, and then that will pull me away from my client even more, thus making me feel even worse. So in this situation, I cannot improve my focus because I'm exhausted and I'm tired, right? But my value, the way that I see, sorry, my value, not my value, but the way that I see myself as a therapist as always being exhausted, always being focused. that was a, that was a very interesting Freudian slip right there. So I have to always be focused, but at the same time, I always have to be very productive and make a lot of money. These two just can't go together. So I have to choose. Either I'll make a lot of money, but then work less well, or at least not meet my standards, in which case I have to change my standards, or I just simply have to work less and then have less money, but then achieve my standards. But in this constellation, I cannot have my cake and eat it too. And in this context, the lesson from my guilt is that I have to make some serious decisions. So there are two different aspects of my identity, or at least my social obligations, that I have to meet, and I cannot meet both of them. So I have to sit down, weigh what's more important. Should I choose my work ethic or my wallet? I mean, for me, that's really not, it's a no-brainer. I would never choose money over my work ethic, but for some, that might actually be a dilemma. Or I don't know, like if you depend on food or housing, it might actually be a serious dilemma. So this is the tougher lesson that we learn from guilt, that we can either condemn ourselves to feeling guilty all the time, or we can make some serious changes, very radical changes, and then live a happier life. But the cost is losing a part of ourselves. So learning from guilt can kind of pave the way for a very long journey of change, because these things don't really change overnight. But these would be two basic directions in which you can work with guilt. And with that, I will stop bothering you and start answering your questions. But before we get to that part, as always, I want to thank TrickStop for allowing us to meet here. And I have a piece of news for some of you, I guess, which is that in the past year or so, we've had quite a number of requests or demands, or however, inquiries, however you want to call it, from people, for parents rather, who have small children who struggle with hair pulling. And our programs are meant for clients who are at least 16 years of age. That's just how they were made, and younger clients don't usually respond very well. So we, after a number of these emails, we decided to create a program for parents. So if you have, I don't know, a child that's like 10, 11, or 8, or 7, whatever, we've created a program for you where our therapists will help you help your child. So this is the best that we could frame it and make it work. So this program is now available as of this month. And now let's go to the Q&A. You can still, of course, ask questions. Oh, sorry, I'm very disorganized this evening. I have to close the poll so that we see what's our topic for June. So in June, you've selected pharmacological treatments for hair pulling. So we will be talking about different medication and how they compare to psychotherapy.